So this was your cube shape, and you did it like this. Did a Y2. So that solution was pretty good in general. The slice count was optimal, but we can modify the U and D moves to be a little shorter and easier to execute. Here's how you do that. You then had this CO, which you did like this. And although your solution was pretty straightforward, you actually had the opportunity to skip EO if you just preserved the block like this and did that. Now your OBL is solved within 2 slices. You then had this EO, which is pretty straightforward. No complaints there. Then you had adjacent as your CP, and you did it in the back like this. But putting it in the back wasn't as smart as doing it in the front because you had to do a 6 and a -3 to position it correctly to do it in the back. But to do it in the front, all you have to do is a 3 on bottom and just do this. Same result. Also, you should have predicted that you would have adjacent as your CP because you had this bar here and this bar here. And you should know that this EO alg doesn't disrupt CP, so you should have gone into the CP alg without any pauses. You then had EP, which had parity, which you dealt with like this. You did adjacent first, and then you reduced it to Z adjacent, which you did like this. And then D2. So this case sucks in general, so reducing it to Z adjacent was a very smart thing to do. However, here's the alg that's 2 slices shorter than that solution. So you actually had the same exact cube shape as the last solve, which you did in the same way, like this. And same thing as the last solve, you should execute it like this. You then did your CO like this. It was a 1 slice CO, pretty straightforward, no complaints there. And then you had this EO alg, which went like this. And the alg itself is fine, but I recommend that you start with a downward slice instead of an upward slice because you locked up a lot in your execution, and doing a downward slice makes a much more consistent execution. So you then had adjacent as your CP, which you did like this. So it's really good that you misaligned the layers to preserve the blocks, because if you didn't, you would have gotten a worse EP, you've gotten ZZ, and you forced good double U-perms, which is the best possible EP you could have forced from that PBL. The only problem is that your recognition was pretty slow on figuring out where exactly to align the blocks, so just practice doing that quicker and recognizing that faster. And then for your EP, you had good double U-perms, which you did like this, standard alg. Good alg in execution, no complaints there. So for your third cube shape, you had this, and you did a Y2, and did it like this. So this was basically the best alg for this cube shape. No complaints about the alg itself. The only problem was the way you executed it. You started with a downward slice, which made your kite scallop start with an upward slice, which is not as good as if you started the algorithm with an upward slice, which would have made your kite scallop a lot smoother. So the only complaint is the direction you did your first slice in. You then had this CO, which you did like this. Pretty straightforward, no complaints here. And for your EO, you had this 3-3 case, which you did with the standard alg. No complaints here, besides the fact that you had a couple slight lockups, but that's okay. That happens. You then had adjacent for your CP, which you did like this. You preserved the block on the top and the blocks on the bottom, so that looked like this. So because you had parity, it actually would have been better to break the block on the U layer and preserve the block on the D layer. The reason being because when you do it, you actually get Z adjacent as your EP, which is a lot better than doing U adjacent. So it would be better to do that. Otherwise, no complaints. And for your EP, you had parity, you had U on top and adjacent on bottom, and you did it like this. This is pretty much the speed optimal alg, so no complaints with the alg, and your execution had a couple minor lockups, so I recommend drilling this alg until you don't get any more lockups. So for your fourth solve, you had this cube shape, which you did like this. So your slice count is optimal, but it's not the best way of doing this alg. The best way would be like this. So you had this CO, and you did it like this. And your execution was very good, so no complaints there. Then you had this 3-3 EO, which you did like this. So the alg itself was really good, but you actually had the opportunity to skip the CP step. This is called CP canceling, when you cancel into your CP alg without any pause. So because we have diagonal corners on the top layer and we have adjacent on the left on the bottom layer, that means that when we finish the EO alg, we're going to have N on top and J on the bottom with this to the left. So the convenient thing is the alg for NJ starts with /3, which means we can cancel into the alg like this. And now we've skipped CP, making the next thing we have to do EP instead of CP. So as I said earlier, you have diagonal on top and adjacent on bottom, and you did the alg like this. No problems there. However, there is a way that you can do this entire PBL in a smarter way. Because when you finish the CP alg, you get a pretty okay case for EP. Adjacent op is pretty good, but it's not the best. The best thing to do is to actually take these two edges and these two edges and do an adjacent in front. And now that reduces it to NJ. So that would be the fastest way of doing that PBL. And then you did your adjacent op alg like this. So very good alg and execution. The only problem was your recognition, so make sure you work on that. To help with recognition, you should have noticed that you had these two blocks on top, which means you would have had two sides solved on the top, and you had these two blocks on bottom, which means you would have two sides solved on bottom. So that means you would either have adjacent, op, or op adjacent. And you do. So you should have gone into the alg more quickly because you should have known that it would have been reduced to two edges on top and two edges on bottom. So for your last solve, you had this cube shape, and you did it like this. So this is the best way of solving that cube shape, and good execution, so no complaints about that. You then had this one slice CO, which you did like that. No complaints there. And then you had this EO, which you did like this. So this is a great alg, and if it works for you, don't switch, but this is the alg I use. It's slightly different. And for your CP, you had adjacent, which you did in the back like this. And the fact that you preserved the blocks actually didn't help you this time. For this case, it would be a better idea to break the blocks for the U layer and preserve the blocks for the D layer so that when you're done, you actually have O opposite, which is way better than adjacent opposite, even with the flipped equator. And then you did adjacent opposite like this. So that's actually a really good alg. I didn't know about that alg before, so I'm going to switch to that one. No complaints here besides the recognition and the slight lockups you had. In general, that case with flipped equator is pretty tough to execute and really easy to lock up on. So not very surprising there, but make sure you drill that. So you've already got really good fundamentals, you have a great understanding of all 5 of your steps, and you've got great finger tricks and pretty good look ahead. With that being said, let's get into what you need to work on. Number 1 is predicting CP during EO. So most of the standard algs in EO don't actually change the corner permutation. Notice how all the corners are solved. So you can look ahead into your CP by noticing where the bars are. See, if I see this back bar and this bar on the left, then I know I'm going to have J on the left and J in the back. What you need to start doing is predicting exactly what your CP is going to be. Once you start practicing paying attention to this, you'll be able to predict it pretty quickly and go into the alg pretty seamlessly. Going one step further than that, there's something called CP canceling, which I did mention in one solve where you had something similar to this, where you have your EO and you have your J bar on the left and you have a diag swap on top. You can go into the alg and skip CP completely, giving you EP. That alg took 5 slices to do 2 steps, whereas the normal way to do it would be 9 slices. So you're cutting off 4 slices in your solve, which is a lot when you're trying to get down to sub 10. These kind of cases can come up a lot more often than you think, and you can save a really good amount of slices by doing them. Number 2 is being smarter with CP. So there were a few instances where preserving the blocks during CP hurt your solve more than it actually helped it. There are a few cases like BD, which looks like this, where if you preserve the block, you get adjacent op, which is a worse EP than if you break the block and give yourself O op. I think this is the same exact case that I covered in your earlier solve, but there are a few more that are really nice. Keep in mind that cases like PJPJ, which swaps 2 corners on both layers, or PNPN, which swaps 2 corners diagonally on both layers. These cases are your friend and can help out seemingly really hard cases, like take this adjacent swap that you have on CP. If you do it normally with JJ in the back, you get a pretty ugly case for EP. You get WO. However, if you do PJPJ, you give yourself good W, which is a 5 slicer. These kind of tricks kind of apply on a case-by-case basis, so I really recommend you experiment with all of them and see what you can find. There are lots of opportunities to force good U-perms and stuff like that. And number 3 is CSP. So it's time you learn CSP. At your speed, you're already seeing sub-10s that don't have parity, and you're usually on track to one during your average solve until you get parity, and then it turns into a 10 or an 11. If you don't get parity on all of your solves, you'll be hovering around high 9 even before applying the other tips that I mentioned. So your solutions are consistent and good enough that if you eliminate parity from your solves, you'll be a lot more consistent in the sub 10 range. There are 2 ways of learning how to trace CSP: blind method and Kale's method. Blind method is what I use, and is when you try to trace each piece on the cycle back to a solved version of that cube shape, which would look something similar to this. You count how many cycles it's going to take to get back to this state, and depending on whether it's an even or an odd amount of cycles, you choose a certain alg to do. For every shape, there's a corresponding reference shape that you need to learn. Like to solve similar fist without parity, you just do the 2-slice solution. But that's an odd amount of cycles. If you trace an even amount of cycles, you'll have to do the parity alg, which is longer. If you know how to do blind on 3x3, it'll help with understanding it a lot. The other one, Kale's method, which as the name suggests was invented by Kale Schoen, involves counting pieces in a different way by sort of chunking them up into groups of 3 and going chunk by chunk to see which ones have parity and then adding those. I really don't know that much about Kale's. I've never learned it and I'm no expert on it at all, so my description might be a little inaccurate. But either way, there are great tutorials for both of them. For blind tracing, the best tutorial is Brandon Lin's, which is in the description. And for Kale's method, Sam Feng, or Cube Master, has a great video explaining it really well, which is also in the description. Both are difficult to learn and even harder to master, but in my opinion, I think Kale's is noticeably easier because you don't have to memorize a reference shape for every cube shape. Once you learn how to trace, start practicing on easy cube shapes, like scallop kite, similar fist, feral barrel, scallop, etc. Let me tell you right here before you start, it is not easy at first. You will mess up a lot and get parity a lot. Learning how to correctly trace is one thing, but learning how to trace correctly every solve takes a lot more time. I recommend being patient with your progress and knowing what you can handle and at what pace you can intake information. You want to make sure you get the fundamentals down first before trying to cram it all under 15 seconds of inspection. Start with infinite inspection or just straight up untimed solves. Once you get your solutions in your muscle memory for CSP, start drilling them and figuring out which starting direction your slice will be in for each cube shape. It makes your cube shape execution much more consistent and regripless. Then, with enough practice and accuracy, you'll see some steady progress. So yeah, that's about it. With those steps, you should be approaching sub 10 pretty consistently. And with enough practice, definitely consistently sub 9 after a while. So yeah, I hope that helped. And yeah, happy practicing. Bye.